The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I walked deeper into the forest, my boots crunching on the gravel path beneath me. I had never been to this part of the woods before. A small cabin stood nestled between towering trees, its wooden frame barely visible through the thick undergrowth. The year was 2023, and at 27 years old, I was far from inexperienced when it came to outdoor adventures. I had grown up camping and hiking, spending countless nights in tents and under the stars. But this cabin, perched on a remote hillside, seemed different. Something about it tugged at the back of my mind, though I couldn't place it. The plan was simple. I needed a weekend to escape, a weekend away from the constant noise of my daily life. Work, city traffic, social obligations, all of it. When I stumbled upon this cabin on an old camping website, I figured it would be perfect. A cozy little retreat in the middle of nowhere, far from any distractions. The owner had listed it as a rustic escape, something out of the ordinary, but the reviews were good, and I was all for a bit of quiet solitude. The cabin came into view as I rounded a bend in the path. It was smaller than I had expected, but charming. The wooden walls were weathered, the roof slanted steeply down to the sides, and the chimney poked out like a crooked finger against the gray sky. There were no other buildings in sight, no sign of other people for miles, just the deep forest surrounding it. I stepped up onto the porch, the wooden planks creaking under my weight, and turned the rusty doorknob. The cabin smelled of pine, old wood, and dust. It was as though it had been waiting for someone to come. A small wooden table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room, a faded rug beneath it. The kitchen was to the right, with a cast iron stove and an old-fashioned sink. There was a tiny wood-burning stove in the corner, with a stack of firewood next to it. The furnishings were simple, nothing extravagant, but it felt homey in a way. I set my backpack down on one of the chairs and made my way to the window. From here, the view was spectacular. The forest stretched out for miles, and beyond that, jagged mountains rose, their peaks shrouded in mist. It was perfect, the kind of place I had been craving. I felt a sense of peace wash over me, the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. I set about unpacking, organizing my things, making sure everything was in its place. I planned to stay here for 2 nights. I didn't intend to do much, just read, relax, and maybe do a little bit of hiking around the area. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned orange, I decided to take a walk around the cabin. The forest felt alive with the sounds of evening creatures, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else, a distant noise. It was faint at first, almost inaudible, but it was there. A low thudding sound, like something heavy hitting the ground. I stopped in my tracks, listening intently. The sound came again, and this time it was closer. I shook it off as a deer or some other forest animal, but the feeling of unease lingered. I had been in forests like this before, but never one so isolated. It was unsettling, in a way I couldn't fully explain. The cabin felt so distant from everything, like it was forgotten by the world, tucked away in the farthest reaches of the woods. I decided it was best to head back inside, where it felt safer. The moment I stepped back onto the porch, I heard the noise again. A sharp thud, then silence. It was coming from the woods, somewhere off to the left, just beyond the trees. I couldn't see anything, but I didn't want to go investigating, not when the forest was so thick and the darkness was creeping in. Inside the cabin, I stoked the fire, the warmth from the crackling logs filling the room. I made a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the night settle in. The silence outside seemed to grow deeper, and that's when I noticed it. The wind had stopped. No rustling leaves, no creaking branches, just a stillness that felt almost unnatural. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. That night, I slept fitfully. The bed was comfortable enough, but every creak of the house, every snap of wood in the fire, kept me awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate steps that moved around the cabin. My heart raced, but when I peeked out the window, I saw nothing but darkness and the outline of trees. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I woke early and made breakfast, determined to enjoy my time here. I headed out for a hike up the nearby hill, eager to explore the area. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, the trees tall and imposing, their trunks covered in moss. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled light on the ground. I tried to focus on the beauty of it all, but the sense of being watched lingered, just at the edge of my awareness. It wasn't until I reached the top of the hill that I found it. An old, rusted hunting stand, its metal frame half hidden by overgrown vines and branches. I approached cautiously, peering up through the gaps in the trees. It looked ancient, as if no one had used it in years. The wood was rotting, the metal oxidized. But what caught my eye was something unexpected. A small pile of what appeared to be animal bones scattered near the base of the stand. I crouched down to examine them. The bones were bleached white, old and brittle, as though they had been there for a long time. There was no sign of any recent animal remains, just these bones, lying in the dirt. A chill ran down my spine. Why would someone leave bones here, in the middle of the woods, far from any other human presence? My mind began to race, but I forced myself to leave the hunting stand behind and head back to the cabin. The afternoon passed without incident, and I began to feel a sense of calm returning to my body. I made dinner, read for a while, and then went to bed. But once again, sleep eluded me. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence of the cabin. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, and I thought I heard something scratching at the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. It was just after midnight when I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening. The noise came from outside, a heavy thud against the cabin wall. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside the bed and crept toward the window. I could see nothing in the darkness beyond the glass, but I heard it again. Thud, thud, thud. My pulse raced. I had no idea what it was, but it was definitely coming from the direction of the woods, just beyond the porch. For a moment, I considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to overreact. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a bear or something large hitting the cabin out of curiosity. But there was an instinct inside me telling me to stay quiet, to stay still. I sat up, listening. The thudding continued for what felt like an eternity, then suddenly stopped. Complete silence returned, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But that wasn't the end of it. A new sound filled the air, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching over the gravel path. They stopped at the porch, and I held my breath, my hands trembling. Whoever or whatever was out there was close now. I could hear them shifting, moving, and then a soft knocking sound on the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I was paralyzed with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The porch was quiet again, and the air felt thick with tension. I waited for what seemed like hours, but nothing happened. I had no idea if whoever had been out there was still around. I couldn't even bring myself to check the door. The thought of opening it and finding something out there in the dark made my blood run cold. By morning, I was exhausted. My nerves were frayed, my sleep disturbed by the events of the night. I knew I couldn't stay any longer, not after what had happened. I packed my things quickly, making sure I didn't forget anything. As I walked out the door and down the porch steps, I glanced at the woods one last time. The silence was back, but it was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It felt ominous, like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't look back as I left the cabin behind, walking quickly down the path that would take me back to my car. The drive home felt longer than it had any right to be, the road stretching out in front of me as if I were being pulled away from something I couldn't fully understand. As I turned the corner and the cabin disappeared from view, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped something. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I'd never go back there. And for the first time in a long while, I was glad to be home. I took the trip in late September of 2022. The summer crowds had already thinned out, and the weather was starting to cool down in the hills around northern Idaho. I was 31, single, and had just finished a long-term project at work that burned me out completely. I had no desire to be around people for a while, no interest in going out drinking or talking to anyone about how stressed I was. I just wanted quiet, real, thick silence. I wanted to feel the world without all the noise we wrap around ourselves every day. I packed up my black Tacoma with all the gear I'd need: tent, food, stove, water filter, first aid kit, knife, bear spray, clothes, boots, fire starter, backup everything. I made a list and checked it twice because I didn't want to end up halfway up a mountain and realize I'd forgotten something basic like matches. I wasn't new to this kind of trip. I'd done a lot of solo hiking and camping in my 20s, mostly in the Colorado backcountry. But this would be the longest solo trip I'd taken in a while. For nights, 5 days, no reception, no people, just me and the woods. I picked a spot in the Panhandle National Forest, up near the Montana border. It wasn't a well-known trail. I found it on a forum where a guy mentioned it in a comment from a few years back. He said the lake up there was cold and clear, and he'd seen nobody for 3 full days. That was all I needed to hear. I parked on a dirt turnoff about 30 miles east of Sandpoint, checked the lock on my truck, and slung my pack over my shoulders. It was heavier than I remembered from past trips, but I figured I'd adjust after the first mile or two. The first few hours of hiking were smooth, steep at times, but manageable. The trail twisted through dense pine, with patches of birch that rattled their dry leaves when the wind picked up. There was that sharp, clean smell of pine needles and cold dirt, and every now and then I'd catch sight of deer trails or scat. I saw a pile of moose droppings that looked fresh, but I didn't spot any actual animals. I made it to the lake by late afternoon. It sat low in a shallow bowl of rock, half ringed by steep cliffs and thick forest. The water was glassy, dark green, with no sign of algae or trash or even footprints near the shore. I set up my tent on a flat stretch about 30 yards from the lake, near a small outcrop that could break some of the wind. I cleared the ground of pine cones and sticks and got the tent staked in tight. Then I got a fire going. Not a big one, just enough to cook and keep warm when the sun dipped. That first night was peaceful. The temperature dropped fast after sunset, and the sky went from orange to deep blue and then black. I watched the stars come out, ate freeze-dried beef stew from a metal pot, and sat by the fire until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I crawled into the tent, zipped up the sleeping bag, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the trees. The next day I spent exploring. I followed a game trail that led up the ridge to the north, climbing until I could see the whole lake from above. It looked even more remote from up there. No tire tracks, no old campsites, no litter, just wilderness. I took a few pictures with my phone, even though I knew I wouldn't be able to send them until I got back. I came back down by early evening and filtered some water from the lake to refill my bottles. The water was cold enough to sting my fingers. That night, something felt off. Not wrong, not dangerous, just off. It started when I was eating. I just finished a packet of chili mac when I heard something move in the trees behind me. Not the wind, not a squirrel. A solid, deliberate snap. A heavy footstep. I stayed completely still and listened. Nothing followed. I waited another 5 minutes, thinking maybe it was a deer that caught my scent. I slowly got up, grabbed my flashlight, and scanned the woods. I didn't see anything. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up thinking I'd heard something. Twigs snapping, movement outside. But each time I unzipped the sleeping bag and sat up to listen, there was only silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The kind that gets inside your ears and makes you feel like you're hearing your own heartbeat. The third day was colder. I stayed close to camp, mostly chopping firewood from a deadfall I'd found and reinforcing the small fire pit with more rocks. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something strange near the shoreline. On the rocks, about 20 feet from the water, was a long, thin strip of dark fabric. At first, I thought it was mine. Maybe something fell out of my pack. But when I picked it up, it wasn't mine. It looked like a sleeve torn from a jacket, black nylon with a Velcro strap and part of a zipper. It was dirty, but not decayed, not weather-worn. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out how it got there. I walked the shoreline in both directions. No other signs of gear. No prints, no wrappers, no tools, no other clothes. Just that one sleeve. I took it back to camp and set it near the fire ring. I didn't want to keep it in the tent. That night was worse than the one before. I was nearly asleep when I heard something heavy walk through the brush. Closer this time. Definitely bipedal. I sat up fast and grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the sound. But again, there was nothing. No eye shine, no movement, just silence after the footsteps stopped. I stayed up most of that night, sitting near the fire with the bear spray in my lap. Every 10 minutes I scanned the woods, shining the light into the trees, checking behind the rocks. I kept the fire going until sunrise. The next morning I made the decision to pack up. I didn't feel right staying another night. I didn't feel scared exactly, just on edge, like something wasn't adding up. I packed quickly and hiked out with more urgency than I had on the way in. I made it back to the truck in the early afternoon, locked the doors behind me, and drove out fast. I didn't tell anyone about the sleeve or the noises, or the way I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me for at least 2 nights. I told myself it could have been a hunter, poacher, someone who didn't want to be seen. But there had been no tire tracks near the trailhead, no other camps, no scent of smoke, nothing. A week after I got home, I kept thinking about it. I couldn't shake the image of that jacket sleeve lying on the rocks. I ended up calling the local ranger station. I told them where I'd camped and what I found, and I asked if anyone else had gone missing up there. The guy on the phone paused a second too long before saying no, nothing recent. He thanked me for the report and said they'd send someone to check it out. A few weeks later, I got curious and searched for missing persons cases in northern Idaho. I didn't expect to find anything, but one result made my stomach flip. A hiker named Derek Callahan had gone missing in September 2021, almost exactly a year before I went. His truck had been found parked near a small trailhead east of Sandpoint. He told his brother he was heading to a remote lake in the forest and planned to be out for 3 nights. They never found him. They searched the area for weeks, but no trace turned up. No gear, no camp, no body. The picture they used in the article showed Derek wearing a black nylon jacket. The same kind of jacket the sleeve had come from. I sat there staring at that photo, the hair on my arms standing up. I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. I felt cold. It wasn't just nerves. It was a deep, twisting fear that settled right in my chest. That place, those woods, that lake was where he disappeared, and I had camped in the same exact spot. I must have been only a few yards from where he'd set up. Maybe I was right on top of where he'd vanished. I didn't call the ranger station again. I didn't tell anyone else what I found. I didn't want to deal with the follow-up, the questions, the possibility that I'd brushed right up against something I shouldn't have. I haven't gone camping since. I still go on hikes, but only during the day and only on marked trails with cell reception. No more solo trips. No more remote spots. I gave away most of my gear a few months after I got back. Not because I was scared I'd see something again, but because I knew that if I did, if I ever heard those footsteps again out in the trees, I might not get the chance to leave next time. Whatever happened to Derek, it happened quietly, without a scream, without a sign. Just one man alone in the woods who never came back. I was lucky. I know that now, and I'm not interested in pushing my luck a second time. I had been working from home for over 2 years straight, staring at screens day and night. My head felt heavy all the time, and I was tired of the noise from traffic outside my apartment in the city. One night, after another long shift, I finally decided I needed a real break. No screens, no emails, just a place where I could breathe again. I started searching for isolated cabins online, and after scrolling for hours, I found one deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It wasn't part of any resort or managed campground, just an old wooden cabin sitting by itself on private land, owned by an old man who barely used it anymore. The photos looked rough but livable, and that's exactly what I wanted. Somewhere quiet and real. I packed my car with enough supplies for a full week, Non-perishable food, water jugs, a first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, a portable stove, clothes, boots, and a few basic tools in case anything broke. I also brought my sleeping bag and a thick wool blanket. The cabin had no electricity, no cell service, and no running water. That made it perfect. The drive took about 8 hours from the city. The last 30 miles were rough, dirt roads full of potholes, tall trees on either side, and no sign of another human anywhere. The GPS cut out about 20 minutes before I reached the cabin. I had to rely on printed directions I'd written down before I left. When I finally arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the tree line, and the air had that crisp bite that told me night was coming fast. The cabin looked like something from another time. The wood was dark from years of weather, the roof slightly sagging on one side. There was a small porch with 2 broken chairs and a crate that looked like it had been used as a table. I stepped inside and was hit with the musty smell of wood, dust, and something a little sour, maybe from a mouse that had died somewhere inside. The single room was small but enough. There was an old iron stove in the corner, a wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a bed frame with a thin, sagging mattress. I opened the windows to air it out and started unpacking. The first night was calm. I boiled water on my portable stove, made some instant noodles, and sat outside in the growing darkness. I hadn't heard another voice in hours, just the occasional rustle of wind through trees or the sound of something moving in the underbrush, probably deer or raccoons. I felt peaceful. That night, I slept in my sleeping bag on top of the mattress. I kept the flashlight by my side, more out of habit than fear. The next few days followed a quiet rhythm. I would wake up early, cook something simple, go on long hikes through the forest, and return before dark. I had no connection to the outside world, and it felt like I was slowly peeling off layers of noise from my mind. My thoughts became clearer. I wasn't thinking about work or emails anymore. Just the sound of my boots on leaves, the way the trees creaked, and the sharp smell of pine. But around the 4th day, something started to feel strange. It was small at first. I noticed some of my food containers had been moved. Not opened, just shifted slightly. I thought maybe I had done it without noticing, but I always put things back in the same spot. Then I found muddy prints near the back of the cabin. Too large for a dog, definitely not a deer. They were boot prints and they were fresh. I hadn't seen a single soul since I arrived. No cars, no hikers, no voices. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe they were old and I just hadn't noticed them earlier. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, hearing noises outside, sticks snapping, leaves crunching. I stayed still, holding my breath. Every time I turned on the flashlight and looked out the window, I saw nothing, just black trees. I told myself again it was probably just animals, maybe a bear, but bears didn't wear boots. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I saw more boot prints, this time circling the backside. Some prints were deep, like someone had stood still for a long time. I checked all the doors and windows again. Everything was shut tight, but I couldn't stop thinking about how far I was from anyone. If someone was out here watching me, they could do whatever they wanted, and no one would know for days, maybe weeks. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed most of my things that day, keeping only what I needed for the night. I'd leave first thing in the morning, but just as the sun was going down, I heard something loud in the woods behind the cabin. Not just a branch breaking, this was different. A crashing sound, followed by silence. I stood frozen in the middle of the room. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded like someone was running through the forest. I turned off the lantern, grabbed my flashlight and knife, and crouched near the window. I aimed the flashlight out the back window and clicked it on. Nothing but trees. I waited, heart thudding so hard I thought it might echo off the walls. Then something moved, just for a second. A flicker of movement behind a tree, far out in the darkness. I kept the light steady, but whatever it was didn't move again. I stayed there for hours, barely blinking. Around midnight, the sound stopped. I locked the door, blocked it with the table, and sat in the corner, knife in hand, waiting for morning. At first light, I threw everything in my car and started driving. I didn't care about the speed. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. But about 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. On the dirt road behind me, I saw a figure standing perfectly still. A man, dressed in dark clothes, maybe wearing a hood. He wasn't walking, just standing there watching. I didn't stop to get a better look. I kept driving until I hit the main road, then kept going another 3 hours before I even considered stopping. When I finally got home, I didn't unpack for days. I left the bags in the corner of the room and just sat in silence. I thought about that figure in the woods, those boot prints, the noises at night. Someone had been watching me the whole time. They never approached directly. They just watched, waited. Maybe they were waiting for me to slip up. Maybe they just liked to scare people. I'll never know. I looked up the cabin again a few weeks later. The listing was gone. I tried contacting the man who owned it, but there was no reply. Eventually, I stopped looking, but I never forgot the way it felt to know I was being watched. The silence of the forest that wasn't really silent. The footprints that weren't mine. The figure in the mirror that didn't move. Now, when people tell me they want to get away from everything, to find peace in the middle of nowhere, I don't say much. But I always think about that cabin. How peace isn't always peaceful. How quiet isn't always safe. I still go hiking sometimes, but I never go alone, and I never go too far off the map. I didn't plan the trip for anything special. I just needed a break. Everything back home had started to feel like noise. My job was the kind that crept into your head even when you weren't at your desk. And I had this constant twitchy need to check my phone. Like if I didn't reply to an email fast enough, the world might fall apart. So I picked a week in October, when the air would be cool but not freezing yet, and drove 5 hours north into Vermont. The plan was simple. Stay 3 nights in the forest near Groton, off one of those smaller trail loops that break away from the bigger campsites. I found it months ago on a hiking blog. The author said that if you walked 1.5 miles past the last designated fire ring, there was a little clearing next to a shallow stream, and barely anyone went that far in. That sounded perfect to me. I got to the trailhead around noon on a Wednesday. The lot was empty except for a white Subaru with a dusty back windshield. I took my pack from the trunk, locked my car, and started walking. It had rained earlier in the week, so the path was damp but not muddy. The leaves were turning all kinds of red and orange, and every now and then, one would flutter down in front of me like it wanted me to notice how pretty it was before it hit the dirt. I passed 2 fire rings along the trail, but kept going until the path started to narrow and the trees grew tighter around me. A fallen log marked the side trail I was looking for, just like the blog said. I turned off and followed a faint footpath down toward the stream. There was no one around, no tire tracks, no voices in the distance, just the sounds of water running somewhere ahead and the crunch of leaves under my boots. The clearing was still there. It had a dip in the middle where the ground was packed down, like others had set up tents before. I dropped my pack and stood still for a while. The air smelled like pine and wet bark. A squirrel ran across a low branch to my right, and birds hopped between trees. It was peaceful in that way you can only get when you're far enough from other people that the air itself feels different. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting up camp. My tent went in the dip in the clearing, and I gathered a circle of stones for a small fire pit. I'd brought enough water to last the 3 days, but I still walked down to the stream just to look at it. It was about 2 feet wide and shallow enough that I could see the smooth pebbles on the bottom. The water ran clear, and the bank on the other side was thick with undergrowth and ferns. That night, I lit a small fire and ate one of those vacuum-packed pasta meals I heated over the flame. The stars came out one by one, and I watched them for a long time. I could still hear the stream trickling below, and every now and then, a rustle from the trees when something small moved in the underbrush. Nothing unusual, just the normal sounds of the woods. I didn't fall asleep right away. It always took me a while on the first night of camping. I kept thinking I heard something just beyond the edge of the clearing, but I reminded myself it was probably just deer or raccoons. It wasn't like there were any predators around here. Sometime after midnight, I finally drifted off. When I woke up, it was from a dream I couldn't remember. but I was sweating despite the cold. I unzipped my sleeping bag a little and turned over, trying to go back to sleep, but then I heard it. Not the rustling again, not the breeze. It was the sound of something heavy snapping a branch. I lay still. I didn't move. I strained to listen. I know animals make noise in the woods all the time, but this didn't sound like a rabbit or a fox. It sounded slow and deliberate, like whatever it was didn't care how much noise it made. The sound moved around the perimeter of the clearing, behind my tent. A crunch of leaves, then another, then nothing. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sky finally started to lighten, I crawled out of the tent, heart still thudding. There were no tracks. Nothing looked disturbed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, or maybe I dreamed the whole thing. I shook it off and went about my morning. I made coffee on my camp stove and sat by the stream. But the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt tense, like the woods were holding their breath. That day, I hiked a loop trail about 3 miles long that circled the ridge near the clearing. I brought a day pack with snacks and a map, and I kept to the trail. It helped to walk. I didn't feel as nervous when I was moving. The forest was empty the whole way. I didn't see another person. No signs of anyone else. When I got back to camp, I checked everything. My tent was untouched. My food bag, which I'd tied up in a tree, was still there. But I kept noticing little things. A rock near my fire pit looked moved. My folding chair had shifted a bit, like maybe it had been knocked or brushed past. They were small details, and I told myself they didn't mean anything. That night, I skipped the fire. I ate inside the tent, trying not to make noise. I kept my flashlight close and didn't unzip the flap. The forest outside felt alive in a different way now. Every creak or crack made me jump. Then, sometime after midnight again, I heard it. A sound like breathing. It wasn't loud. It was faint, almost like wind moving through a tunnel. But it was rhythmic. Inhale, pause, exhale. I held my own breath to make sure it wasn't just me. The sound was right outside the tent. Then I heard another snap. Closer this time. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I had a bear spray canister in my hand, but my fingers were shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could use it right. I lay there, eyes wide, staring into the dark. And then, like the night before, silence. No footsteps, no breathing, just nothing. When the sun came up, I burst out of the tent. Again, no tracks, no signs. I walked in a wide circle around the clearing, checking for anything out of place. Nothing, but I knew what I heard. That was my second night. I still had one left. I didn't want to pack up early. I told myself if I left now, I'd never come back to the woods again. That fear would win. So I stayed. I forced myself to stay. During the day, I built up the fire pit and added extra wood. I made sure I had my knife, my bear spray, and a metal tent stake within reach. I checked my phone, even though I hadn't had signal since I left the car. Still nothing. Before the sun went down, I walked the perimeter again. About 50 yards from camp, I found something I hadn't seen before. A patch of ground where the leaves had been brushed away. Not a full path, but a spot where it looked like something or someone had stood. A spot with clearer soil and a long scuff mark. I stared at it for a long time. Then I walked back to camp. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright inside the tent, flashlight off, just listening. The forest outside was quiet. Too quiet. Not even birds. No insects. Just this thick, heavy silence. Then, sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard the crunch of leaves again. It was coming straight toward me. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't trying to sneak. The steps were slow, deliberate, moving through the undergrowth toward my tent. I clenched the bear spray in one hand and kept my other hand near the zipper of the tent flap. The steps stopped a few feet away. I could hear breathing again. Soft, steady. Then nothing. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. Still nothing. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped out slowly. That's when I saw the footprint. It was in the soft dirt by the edge of the clearing. A boot print. Definitely not mine. It was larger than mine and the tread was different. I scanned the woods in every direction. Nothing moved. I packed up as fast as I could. Tent, stove, food bag, everything jammed into my pack. I didn't even eat. I hiked out without stopping. I didn't look back. I didn't take photos. I just kept moving until I reached the car. The white Subaru was gone. I threw my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and drove until I hit the nearest gas station with a signal. I never reported it. I didn't know what I would have said. There wasn't a crime. There was no proof. Just footprints, sounds, and a feeling I can't explain. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I haven't gone camping alone since. I didn't plan the trip very well, and I'll be the first to admit that. I wanted to get away for a weekend and clear my head, and I picked a random area in the state I'd never been to before. A quiet patch of forest somewhere near the base of the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania. I don't remember the exact name of the trailhead, but I found it on a hiking forum, and it had just enough information to feel legit without looking touristy. It sounded like what I wanted. No crowds, no campsites, no rules. Just trees, dirt, and time to be alone. I packed my gear on a Thursday night, slept maybe 3 hours, and drove out early the next morning with a thermos of stale coffee and a half-eaten breakfast burrito from a gas station I don't think I could find again if I tried. I got to the trailhead a little after 10 in the morning. It was a cracked gravel lot with a rusted metal sign and no cars. I remember that specifically. No cars at all. It was quiet in a way that makes you stop and notice it. No birdsong, no wind. Just the crunch of my boots on gravel and the low ticking sound of my cooling engine. I shut the car off, left the keys buried under the floor mat just in case something happened to me and someone needed to find them, and started the hike in. I had everything I needed: tent, water filter, freeze-dried food, matches, a knife, a basic med kit, a paper map I printed at home, and my old hiking pack with the right weight balance. I've done enough solo trips to know what can go wrong. I thought I was ready for anything. The hike in was uneventful for the first couple of hours. The trail wasn't marked, but the path was visible if you paid attention. Mostly just a flattened corridor through the trees, winding gently uphill. I walked for maybe 3 hours at a steady pace before I decided to start looking for a place to set up camp. I wanted to be far enough from the car that I wouldn't hear any sounds from the road, and this seemed like the perfect spot. I found a flat, elevated patch of ground just off the trail, partially surrounded by a thicket of young pines. Good natural windbreak, close to a small creek maybe 30 feet downhill. The sun was out but filtered through the trees, and everything smelled like damp leaves and pine needles. I dropped my pack, stretched, and started setting up the tent. It was one of those lightweight 2-pole kinds, quick to pitch and solid if staked down right. I took my time with it, making sure everything was taut. I collected firewood for later and filtered some water from the creek. I remember the water was clear and freezing cold, and I knelt there for a while just watching it run past the rocks, listening to the soft rush of it. For a few hours, it felt exactly like I'd wanted, peaceful, still, like the rest of the world had shut off. That changed later around dusk. It started with the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in a supernatural way, nothing dramatic like that. Just a slow, creeping sensation like I was being watched. I brushed it off at first. It happens sometimes when you're alone in the woods for too long. Your brain starts to play tricks on you, fills in silence with paranoia. But then I noticed something that made me stop pretending it was just in my head. There were fresh tracks on the trail. Not boot prints, bare feet, human feet, medium-sized, going the opposite direction from where I'd come. The mud was still wet in the depressions, not dry and cracked like mine were. I followed them for a few feet with my eyes before they disappeared into the underbrush. No path, no direction, just straight off the trail and into the woods. I stood there for a while, listening. Nothing. No twigs snapping, no animals, no voice. I looked up at the sky, then back at the prints, then back toward my camp. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was already late, and I didn't want to hike in the dark. I told myself someone else must have come out here. Maybe a forager, someone off-grid, or even another camper who preferred walking barefoot. Strange, sure, but not impossible. I went back to camp and lit a fire, even though I didn't plan to. I thought it might help settle my nerves. I boiled water, made some food, and sat there watching the flames dance while the light slowly died behind the trees. The night settled in hard and fast. The stars came out and the temperature dropped quick. I layered up, zipped into my bag, and tried to sleep. I woke up to the sound of branches cracking somewhere close. Not like a squirrel or raccoon. Heavier. 2 short cracks, then silence. I stayed completely still. The fire had died down to glowing coals, and everything was dark except for the faint red light from the embers. I couldn't see anything outside the tent, but I knew someone was out there. I could hear breathing, not an animal sniffing around. Breathing, human, slow, controlled, like someone trying to be quiet. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent or grab my knife or turn on my flashlight. I just lay there listening, heart thudding so hard I thought it would give me away. The breathing stayed steady for a while, then faded. Not suddenly, just slowly got quieter until I couldn't hear it anymore. I waited another hour before I even moved. When I finally unzipped the tent and looked out, there was nothing. No tracks, no shapes in the trees. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten. That morning I found something that changed everything. On a low branch near the creek, tied loosely with what looked like vines, was a strip of fabric. Dark, reddish-brown. Could have been part of a shirt or pants. It was frayed and stained. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a long time. It hadn't been there the day before. I would have seen it. I'm sure of that. I went back to the tent and packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't refill my water. I just got my gear together and started hiking back down the trail. I checked my map a few times to stay on track, but the trail seemed off, like the turns weren't quite where they were supposed to be. I kept moving anyway. About 2 hours into the hike, I found something that stopped me cold. A shelter. Not a real one, something handmade. Just a few thick branches leaned against a tree trunk and covered in dried pine needles and bark. It wasn't obvious. I only noticed it because a squirrel darted across the trail and disappeared into it. I looked inside. There was nothing in there. No bedding, no gear. But it had been used. The ground inside was packed flat, and around the edges, almost hidden by leaves, were small piles of bones. Animal bones, mostly, but one looked too long, too straight. I didn't stay to figure out what it was. I backed out, turned around, and kept walking. The trail kept feeling unfamiliar, like it shifted when I wasn't looking. Trees that I'd passed before looked different in the light. Some stumps I was sure I'd seen on the way in were missing. I stopped trusting my memory. I started checking my compass every few minutes. The direction stayed consistent, at least. South, toward the trailhead. I kept moving. Sometime in the afternoon I found my own boot prints. The ones I'd made the day before. But they weren't right. They were mixed with more barefoot tracks. Too many, overlapping, going in all directions. It looked like someone had been following me, watching where I walked, maybe even stepping where I stepped. I wanted to run, but I knew better. Running just leads to mistakes. So I walked, as fast as I could without making noise, checking behind me every few steps. When I finally saw the parking lot again, I almost cried. My car was still there. The sun was low, sky tinged with orange. I ran the last 50 feet, heart hammering, and yanked open the driver's side door. The inside was exactly how I left it. I didn't check the back seat. I just started the engine and peeled out, gravel spraying behind me. I drove for an hour before I pulled over at a gas station. I checked the whole car. Nothing. No one. No signs of anyone having been inside. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a while. I didn't want to sound crazy. It was weeks before I went back to the woods again, and even then, I stuck to busy trails. I never found that forum post again. The trailhead disappeared from my saved pages. I don't know if it was deleted or if I imagined it differently, but I know I wasn't alone out there. Someone lives in those woods. Maybe not on any map, maybe not someone you'd ever meet in a town, but someone with bare feet and quiet breathing. Someone who watches. And that strip of fabric is in a plastic bag in the bottom drawer of my desk. I don't know why I took it. I didn't touch it with my hands. I used a stick. Maybe I needed proof. A reminder. I haven't been back to that part of the state. I probably never will. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and it's dead silent, I think I hear breathing again. Slow, measured, just outside the window. I get up. I check. There's never anything there, but I still check. Every time. It was just supposed to be a weekend getaway. A few days to escape the noise of the city, get away from work, and clear my head. I found this little cabin in the woods, tucked away far enough that no one could hear you scream, though I wasn't expecting that to be something I'd think about. The cabin was old, but sturdy. It had that worn-down charm that made it feel lived in, like it had stories to tell. I figured it would be a perfect retreat for some quiet time. I could get some reading done, maybe even write a bit, but I certainly didn't plan on anything else. The drive up was beautiful. The leaves on the trees were turning, painting the landscape in rich yellows, oranges, and reds. It wasn't too cold yet, but the chill of autumn was settling in. When I pulled into the small gravel parking area, the cabin seemed to appear out of nowhere, almost as if the trees had parted to let me in. The wood had a deep, weathered brown color, the kind of wood that felt alive, as if it had been shaped by countless years of rain and sun. It wasn't huge, just a small one-bedroom, but enough for me. The door creaked when I opened it. The smell of aged pine and old wood hit me immediately, followed by the scent of a wood stove that had been unused for a while. I set down my bag and took a moment to soak it all in. There was something soothing about the quiet, something I hadn't realized I needed until that very moment. I closed the door behind me, kicked off my boots, and looked around. The place was exactly what I needed. It had a rustic charm. Simple furniture, an old rocking chair by the window, a few mismatched rugs on the wooden floor. The kitchen area was small but functional, with a stove that looked like it had been there since the cabin was first built. A single bed, an antique dresser, and a worn-out armchair in the corner completed the room. Everything seemed to have a history. The place was perfect. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the stove, careful to get the kindling just right. The warmth from the fire filled the room, and I pulled a blanket from the bed, settling into the armchair to read a book I'd brought. Hours passed without me even realizing it. The peaceful silence was comforting, and the crackling of the fire added a rhythm to the quiet. But as night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a creeping sense of unease that settled in with the dark. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my book, but I kept glancing up at the window, where the blackness of the forest outside pressed in. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and the cabin creaked every now and then, which I chalked up to the old wood settling. Still, that feeling gnawed at me like someone or something was just beyond the trees watching. I tried to shake it off. There was nothing out there. I was just being paranoid. By the time I finished my book and got ready for bed, I decided to make the most of the situation. The fire had burned down to embers, and the warmth in the room had faded. I blew out the candle on the table, pulled the covers up, and tried to sleep. But the night didn't feel right. It was too quiet. I was used to the occasional sounds of animals, the chirp of crickets, the rustling of leaves. But here, in this deep forest, there was nothing. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. I turned in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there for hours, my mind racing. I kept hearing soft sounds, like something scraping against the cabin's walls, or footsteps moving just outside the window. But every time I looked, there was nothing. I wasn't sure whether it was the darkness playing tricks on me or if something really was out there. The wind outside started picking up again, but it didn't feel like wind. It felt different. The trees groaned, and I could almost hear them bending and swaying in ways that felt unnatural. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and decided to step outside to see what was going on. I pulled on my boots and stepped onto the wooden porch. The night air was colder than I expected, sending a chill straight through my jacket. I clicked on the flashlight and scanned the area. The beams swept over the trees, the ground, but there was nothing. No movement, no rustling, no sign of life. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the anxiety that had been building. Everything seemed still now, but the feeling didn't leave. The darkness felt thicker here, as though it was somehow more real. I didn't want to go back inside, not just yet, so I started walking around the cabin, flashlight in hand, checking for anything that could explain the sounds. I didn't find anything out of the ordinary, just trees, rocks, and the occasional bush. But when I came around to the back of the cabin, I saw something odd. There was a small clearing just beyond the tree line, and there, at the edge of the clearing, was a pile of broken branches, twisted and piled up in a way that seemed deliberate. It was too neat, too arranged to be natural. My heart started pounding as I stood there, staring at it. I wanted to go back inside, lock the door, and forget about it, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I approached the pile cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of movement, but it was silent, too silent. As I stood there, my mind started to race with all the worst possible scenarios. Someone had been here watching me. Maybe they were still out there, hiding, waiting for me to turn my back. I knew I had to go back inside, but the thought of turning around and walking back into that cabin, alone, made my skin crawl. But then, something shifted. I heard it, a snap as though a branch had broken underfoot. I froze, straining my ears, but there was no sound after that. It was just the wind again, right? I turned quickly, scanning the darkness once more. My breath came out in quick bursts now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, in the trees, watching. I made the decision to go back inside. I didn't care how ridiculous it seemed. The cabin was safety, and that was all that mattered. But just as I turned to head back to the porch, I heard the snap again, closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were close. I broke into a run, sprinting back toward the cabin, my boots thudding against the wooden steps. I burst inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it behind me. My mind was racing, and my pulse was loud in my ears. I didn't know what I'd heard, but I wasn't taking any chances. I closed the curtains, double-checked the windows, and settled on the couch, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, the sun rose, and everything felt normal again. The cabin was still standing, the trees were still just trees, and there was no sign of any danger. But the unease hadn't disappeared. Something didn't feel right, like there was something I was missing, some small detail I hadn't noticed. I spent the day inside, not daring to go outside again. I thought about leaving, packing up and heading back to the city, but I didn't want to let fear win. So I stayed. The next few days passed without incident. I kept myself busy, reading, writing, exploring the woods in daylight, but always staying close to the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I had no concrete reason for it. Eventually, I decided I'd leave a day earlier than planned. I packed my things, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. But as I stepped outside, I froze. In the clearing by the trees, the pile of branches was gone. It was as though it had never been there. I don't know what happened that night or who or what was out there, but when I left, I did it in a hurry. I didn't look back. I don't care to know if there was someone watching me or if I just let my imagination get the better of me. What I do know is that I never want to go back to that cabin. Some things are better left alone. The sun had just set, leaving behind the last streaks of orange across the sky. I sat by the edge of the campfire, the crackling of the wood the only sound breaking the night's silence. It had been a quiet afternoon, the kind of calm I was hoping for when I decided to take this solo camping trip. There was something therapeutic about being away from everything. Away from work, away from people, and away from the usual noise of life. This was the first time in a while I could just breathe, stretch out my thoughts, and let everything fade into the background. I had set up camp near a small, remote lake. The path leading to it had been long, and the trail was almost overgrown, as if nature had been trying to reclaim it. But that made it perfect for someone like me, who was seeking solitude. I hadn't seen a single person since the trailhead, and the only sounds around me were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. The lake, reflecting the deepening blue sky, seemed so serene. It was just me, my tent, and the crackling fire. As I poked the fire with a stick, the orange embers burst up into the night air, creating tiny sparks that scattered briefly before fading into the darkness. I tossed a few more logs on the fire, the smell of burning wood mixing with the fresh scent of pine. Everything felt right, peaceful. I wrapped myself in my jacket and leaned back against the log I had been sitting on, letting the warmth from the fire seep into my skin. There were no plans, no rush, just me and the wilderness. The wind picked up a bit, rustling the trees around me. I shivered slightly as the temperature dropped, but I wasn't worried. I had brought a heavy sleeping bag, and the fire would keep me warm enough for the night. As I stared at the flames, I found myself growing drowsy. It had been a long day of hiking, and despite the fact that I was alone in this vast stretch of forest, I didn't feel afraid. I was used to being out in the wilderness. This was my third solo camping trip, and nothing had ever gone wrong before. The worst thing I had experienced was a raccoon stealing my food. But as the minutes passed, something about the quietness of this place started to feel a little off. It was subtle at first, like a low hum in the back of my mind. There were no more animal sounds, no distant calls from birds or the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. It was as though the world around me had held its breath, waiting for something. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The solitude was starting to get to me, that was all. I had a habit of overthinking when I was alone too long. But then, as I stared at the fire, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A twig snapped, somewhere just beyond the light of my campfire. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up straight, my eyes scanning the darkness around me. The wind had stopped completely, and everything was still. Too still. It was probably just an animal. There were plenty of small creatures in the woods, and the forest was full of life, even if I couldn't see it. Still, the snap of the twig had been too loud, too distinct. I tried to push the thought from my mind and focus on the fire, but my ears strained for any other sounds. Nothing came, just the steady, rhythmic crackling of the fire. Minutes passed. The fire continued to burn, and the woods stayed quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or a raccoon had wandered too close. I'd heard strange sounds like that before on camping trips, and they were always easily explained away. But then I heard it again, a faint rustling, followed by another sharp snap of a twig. This time it was closer, much closer. I froze, my blood running cold. My mind raced, running through possibilities. I knew there were bears in these woods, but they weren't usually this close to camp. I had hung my food in a tree, well away from the tent, just in case. Still, the idea of a bear wandering nearby made my skin crawl. The sound came again, and this time it was unmistakable. A soft shuffle, like footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving through the forest near my camp. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as my heart pounded in my chest. Whoever or whatever was out there, I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dark, revealing the forest around me, but nothing stood out. The trees, the underbrush, everything seemed normal. I could hear the faint sound of my own breathing as I scanned the area. But there was no one there, no animal, no figure, just the dark, silent trees. I slowly stood up, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadows just beyond the light. My body felt tense, my muscles tight as I clutched the flashlight in one hand, a heavy stick in the other. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I wasn't taking any chances. Whatever had been out there, I wasn't going to be caught off guard. Minutes ticked by, and I stood motionless by the fire, the light of the flames flickering across the trees. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Maybe it was just a deer. Maybe it was just the wind again, playing tricks on me. I wasn't sure. But then, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were clearer, closer. Whoever or whatever was out there, was moving toward me. The sound was deliberate, too precise to be an animal. I could hear it moving through the brush, the faint rustle of leaves and the soft snap of twigs underfoot. I spun around, my flashlight casting erratic beams across the forest, but I saw nothing. There was nothing there, nothing I could point to. My heart pounded in my chest as panic began to settle in. I tried to steady my breath, telling myself it was nothing, that it was just the wind or some other natural explanation. But something deep inside me told me that wasn't the case. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the night. My breath came out in shallow gasps as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. I kept the light trained on the trees, my eyes scanning the shadows. I had no idea who or what was out there, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. The unease that had been creeping up on me all night was now a heavy weight in my stomach. It wasn't just a bear. It wasn't just an animal. This felt different. I took a slow step back toward my tent, my eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the fire. Every rustle, every shift in the wind made me jump. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was suffocating. I wasn't alone out here. That much was clear. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a shadow moving between the trees, just beyond the range of my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow was tall, slender, and moving with purpose. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a figure slipping between the trees. My heart hammered in my chest as I quickly ducked down behind a large boulder near the fire. I had no idea what it was, but it was too big, too deliberate to be some random animal. The silence stretched on, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It grew stronger, more oppressive. Whoever or whatever it was still out there, just out of sight, waiting. I tried to calm myself, to think. Should I leave? Should I pack up and hike back to the trailhead, where I might be able to find help? The thought of running in the dark, of stumbling through the woods, made my stomach churn. But staying wasn't an option either. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I grabbed my things, my backpack, my sleeping bag, and shoved them into the tent. I didn't bother folding anything properly. I just needed to move. But as I hurriedly packed up, the footsteps returned. Slow, deliberate, moving toward me. I froze. My body was on alert. Every muscle tensed as I waited for the next sound. My heart pounded so loud in my ears, I was sure it would give me away. The footsteps stopped. There was no sound now, just the quiet hum of the night. Then the voice came. It was faint, barely a whisper carried on the wind. "You shouldn't be here." I didn't know what to do. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew they were close, too close. I backed away from the voice, my hands shaking. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The words echoed in my head. I was alone, but I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath and sprinted. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away. I wasn't sure how far I ran, how long I stumbled through the trees, until I finally broke into the open. My eyes blurred with tears as I gasped for breath, my body shaking from the rush of adrenaline. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead. The familiar sign of the path back to civilization was a relief, but I didn't look back. Not once. The next day, I went back to the site with a park ranger. My camp was untouched, the fire long gone cold. There were no signs of anything out of the ordinary. No footprints, no broken branches. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. My friends and I had planned a trip to a remote cabin tucked away in the woods for a weekend of peace, relaxation, and a bit of hiking. The idea of being away from the hustle and bustle of daily life felt like the perfect way to recharge. It was early fall. The leaves had started to turn golden, and the air had a crisp bite to it that made it feel like everything was fresh and new. The cabin was located somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, in a part of West Virginia where cell service was non-existent, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The sort of place where the only sounds you'd hear at night were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. I had rented the place online after seeing a couple of photos, nothing fancy, but exactly what we were looking for. A simple, secluded cabin with a fireplace, a porch with a view, and a couple of old wooden rocking chairs on it. A place to get away from everything. The website mentioned how the cabin had been built in the 1960s, and from the photos, it looked like it hadn't changed much since then. I liked that. It was part of its charm. I packed my bags the night before the trip, feeling excited but also a little uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on why I felt that way, but I chalked it up to the nerves I always get before heading into unfamiliar places. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't dread, just a sense of something unknown lurking just under the surface. The drive there was long, about 4 hours from the city, and the road narrowed the further we went. We passed small towns, then dirt roads, and eventually found ourselves on a gravel path that twisted through dense woods. My friend, Ben, who had driven most of the way, was starting to get a little irritated. He'd had a rough week at work, and I could tell the winding roads were testing his patience. The sun was setting by the time we finally reached the cabin, and the darkening sky made the place look even more isolated. There were no other houses in sight. I wasn't sure if I liked that or not, but it was too late to turn back now. I was eager to get inside, unpack, and start the weekend. We parked the car in front of the cabin and unloaded our things. The cabin looked exactly as I had remembered from the pictures. A 2-story wooden structure with a steep roof, a chimney, and large windows that let in a lot of light. The porch was covered with a thick layer of dust, but it still had its charm. The kind of charm you'd expect from a place that had seen many seasons, but had remained mostly untouched by time. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine wood and a slight musky scent that I couldn't place. The living room was modest, with a stone fireplace, an old wooden coffee table, and a couple of worn-out sofas. There was a small kitchen to the left, and a staircase leading up to the bedrooms on the second floor. The wood beams in the ceiling were dark, and the floor creaked under our footsteps. It felt like a place frozen in time, and in some strange way, I liked that. We set up for the night, lit a fire in the fireplace, and unpacked our food and drinks. Ben opened a few beers, and we all sat around the fire, talking about random stuff. It felt good to be away from everything, to just relax and enjoy the company. The weather outside had turned cooler, and the wind started to pick up, making the trees outside sway and groan. That's when I started feeling it, the quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind of silence that feels a bit too heavy. It wasn't like the world had stopped, but more like something was missing. I shook it off, though. I was just being paranoid, I thought. The others were all having a good time, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin the mood. As the night wore on, we decided to head to bed. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, and we each took one. I ended up in the larger room at the front of the cabin, with a big window that faced the woods. The curtains were heavy, and I pulled them shut before lying down. The bed was comfortable enough, but the creaking of the old wooden frame kept me tossing and turning. I found myself staring out the window in the dark, the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. Around midnight, I finally managed to drift off to sleep, but the peace didn't last long. I woke up to the sound of a loud thud. It was the kind of sound that made you sit up straight in bed, heart pounding. I froze, listening. The house was silent again. I couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe an animal outside, or a branch hitting the roof. I tried to go back to sleep, but something was nagging at me. I kept hearing small noises, the kind you might ignore in a normal house, but in a place this isolated, they felt amplified. A few hours passed, and I finally fell back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The cabin was still cold, but the sun was starting to rise, casting a pale orange light over everything. I rubbed my eyes and sat up in bed, feeling groggy. I decided to head downstairs to make some coffee. Ben was already in the kitchen making breakfast. He looked tired, his face pale. "Did you hear anything last night?" he asked, without looking up from the stove. I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't told anyone about the noises, but hearing him bring it up made me feel a little less crazy. "Yeah, actually, a few weird sounds. like something bumping against the house. Ben nodded. Same here. I thought it was an animal, but I don't know. It didn't sound like that. We shrugged it off, though. It was probably just the house settling or an animal in the woods. Nothing to get worked up over. The day passed uneventfully. We went for a hike up the nearby trail, passing through dense forest, and even stumbled upon a small stream where we stopped for a bit. It was a beautiful spot, quiet and serene. We talked about everything and nothing, enjoying the simplicity of being away from the city. That night, we made a big dinner, grilled steaks and vegetables over the fire. The night sky was clear, and we spent a few hours sitting outside, watching the stars. But again, as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. It was like something was watching us, though I couldn't explain why I felt that way. We all went to bed early that night, and I tried to sleep as quickly as I could. But it wasn't long before the noises started again. First, a small knock, then another thud, followed by the sound of something scraping against the wood. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The house felt too still, too quiet. I got up and went to check the windows. Nothing outside. No animals, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But I still couldn't shake the feeling. It was like I was being watched from the shadows of the trees, even though I knew that was impossible. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I found myself listening to the wind howling outside, wondering if it was just the trees causing the strange sounds. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again. This time it was louder, and it definitely came from inside the house. I grabbed my flashlight and crept down the stairs. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but I didn't care. I had to know what was happening. The house was dark and still, and I moved through it cautiously, shining the light on everything. The kitchen was empty, the living room too. That's when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the sound, reaching the basement door at the end of the hallway. The door was ajar, and I could see a faint light flickering from below. I didn't want to go down there. I wanted to turn around, go back upstairs, and pretend this was all in my head. But my legs moved on their own, and I descended into the darkness. What I found in the basement was enough to make me freeze in terror. There, in the far corner of the basement, was a pile of old furniture. Broken chairs, dusty boxes, and an old wooden cabinet. And next to it, there was a trapdoor in the floor, half hidden by the furniture. The dragging noise had come from this door. Someone or something had been moving it. I don't know why, but I walked closer to it. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle, my flashlight trembling in my grip. With one hard pull, the trapdoor creaked open. Underneath was a narrow, dark space, almost like a crawl space. And in the very center of it, there was something. A bundle, wrapped in a tattered sheet. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but when I shone the flashlight on it, my stomach dropped. It was a pile of old clothes, and under them there was something that looked like a bag, a human-sized bag, a bag that had been sitting there, hidden for who knows how long. I felt my body go numb, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. My mind was racing, and I had to force myself to think clearly. Someone had been down there. Someone had been hiding in the basement, and they had left whatever it was down there. I ran upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't even hear my own footsteps over the blood rushing in my ears. I reached my friends' rooms, waking them up, and we decided to leave. We packed our things in a hurry, not even bothering to lock the door behind us. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin. The lights were still on, the porch empty. I didn't know what had been hidden under that trapdoor, but I knew one thing for sure. We weren't coming back. It was the middle of autumn when I decided to get away from the noise of the city. I was 27, feeling the weight of a few too many late nights at work, too many stressful deadlines, and too many evenings spent surrounded by people I barely knew. I needed quiet. I needed solitude. So, when I stumbled upon an ad online for a small cabin in the woods, tucked away near a lake about 2 hours from where I lived, I booked it. No second thoughts. No hesitation. The cabin was an old one, built somewhere in the late 70s, according to the owner. He seemed like the type who didn't really care much for modern amenities or technology, and I was okay with that. I wanted the disconnection, the peace, and the raw simplicity of nature. I wanted to be cut off. I packed only the basics: clothes, food, some books, and a few things to make the cabin more comfortable. The car ride out there was pleasant enough, though the roads grew more uneven as I drove farther from the nearest town. The deeper I got into the woods, the more I felt the weight of isolation settle over me. When I finally arrived, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the cabin. It was smaller than I had imagined, but it had character. The wooden beams were worn and weathered by time, but the place felt solid. There were no neighbors, no signs of civilization, just trees, dirt roads, and the constant murmur of the nearby lake. The only thing that could be heard was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I unloaded my car, carried my bags inside, and immediately began setting up. The cabin had an old stove, a few mismatched chairs, a small fireplace, and a single bedroom with a bed that creaked whenever you moved. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books, some of which I planned to read. I could already feel the stress of the city beginning to fade. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple dinner over the stove, set up a fire, and settled in with a book. I didn't feel scared, not even a little. The solitude was peaceful. I went to bed early, wrapped up in the warmth of the blankets, listening to the sounds of the woods outside. But then, on the second night, things started to change. It was about midnight when I was awoken by a noise. I wasn't sure what it was at first. A creak? A knock? My mind raced through the possibilities. Branches brushing against the cabin, the wind howling, or maybe just the house settling. I tried to ignore it, turning over and pulling the blanket tighter around me. But the noise came again, louder this time. A thud, a scraping sound. My heart rate quickened, and I couldn't dismiss it. Something wasn't right. I got out of bed, careful not to make too much noise. The cabin was dark, with only the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. I grabbed a flashlight and moved to the window. Outside, it was pitch black, except for the occasional flicker of moonlight through the trees. I couldn't see anything moving, nothing that would explain the sound. But the air felt different, heavier, colder, almost oppressive. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. The woods were strange, after all, and the isolation played tricks on your mind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the next hour checking the locks on all the windows and doors, double-checking that everything was in place. It was fine, I told myself. It had to be. After all, I was alone in a cabin, miles away from anyone. There was no reason to be afraid, but I couldn't get back to sleep. Every noise outside, every rustle of leaves, made my muscles tense. I lay there, listening to the stillness of the night, hoping for it to pass. The following morning, I woke up exhausted, but I decided to ignore the unease I felt. I made some coffee and spent the day outside, walking by the lake, breathing in the fresh air, and trying to clear my head. The weather was chilly, but the sun was out, and the autumn colors were in full swing. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about the silence. Even though there were birds, insects, and the occasional animal moving through the trees, it felt as if the forest was holding its breath. It was too quiet. No distant hum of traffic, no sounds of people. Just me and the endless stretch of trees. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard the noise again. This time it was closer, coming from the back of the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. This was something more deliberate. Something human. I froze, my hand stilling over the stove. My heart skipped a beat. I set the spatula down slowly, then crept to the back window, the one that faced the forest. Nothing. No one. I checked the back door, locked. All the windows were shut, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. Someone watching me. By the third night, the sense of unease had grown to a palpable fear. I hadn't heard anything during the day, but every time the wind picked up, I felt like I was being surrounded. I locked every door and window again, but this time I didn't feel safe. Every creak of the wood, every distant thud made my skin crawl. I made the decision to leave. It wasn't worth staying in a place that made me feel like this. But as I began packing my things, I noticed something strange. My car keys were missing. I searched the cabin from top to bottom, going through every drawer, every shelf, even checking the fireplace, but the keys were gone. There was no way I could have misplaced them. I hadn't even taken them out of my pocket since I arrived. At this point, panic started setting in. I checked my phone, but there was no service, no bars, no connection to the outside world. That's when I heard it again, this time unmistakable. A heavy knock at the front door. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Someone was definitely out there. I didn't know what to do. There was no way I was opening the door, not with whatever or whoever was on the other side. I grabbed the axe from the corner by the fireplace, the only tool that could offer any kind of protection, and waited. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. The knock didn't come again. The air was still, but the unease didn't leave. I stayed awake, listening for any more sounds, for anything that would give me a clue about what was going on. But it was quiet again, as if the world had gone still. The next morning, I found my car keys on the front step. No sign of anyone, no footprints in the dirt. It was as if the night had never happened. But I couldn't leave fast enough. I packed up everything and got in my car, started the engine, and drove off. As I passed the long stretch of road leading out of the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone had been watching me the entire time, and that whatever it was still out there, waiting. I don't know what happened out there, but I do know one thing. I've never gone back, and I don't plan to. There are places in this world that you just don't go. There are things in the woods that you don't want to find, and some things are better left undiscovered. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A few days alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, away from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just quiet. That was the plan. I had rented the cabin from a small listing I found online. It was old, simple, and far from any major roads. It had been used mostly as a hunting cabin, according to the description. There was a single dirt path leading to it, barely wide enough for my truck. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive out took longer than expected. The last stretch was rough, the road uneven, potholes filled with water from recent rain. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself looked like something from an old photograph. Weathered wood, a small porch, and a tin roof. It stood alone, surrounded by thick forest. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I parked and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. There was no noise except for the occasional rustling of leaves. No cars, no people, just silence. I liked it. The inside of the cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a couch against the far wall. A door led to a tiny bedroom with a single bed, and there was a bathroom with an old shower that barely worked. It wasn't luxury, but it was what I needed. I unpacked my things, set up my sleeping bag on the bed, and started a fire in the old wood stove. The temperature had dropped fast, and the warmth was welcome. I made a quick meal, ate at the table, and then sat on the porch for a while, watching the woods darken. The trees were so thick that once the sun was gone, it felt like the world ended just beyond the cabin's small clearing. That night, I slept lightly. The bed was uncomfortable, and the wind outside made the trees creak. I woke up a few times, feeling like something had disturbed me, but there was nothing, just the silence pressing in. At some point, I fell into a deeper sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The fire had died, and the air inside was cold. I got up, stretched, and went outside to gather some firewood. The cabin had a small shed a few yards away, stocked with dry logs. As I walked over, I noticed something that made me stop. There were footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the woods to the porch, stopping right at the front door. Then they turned and went back into the trees. They were deep, meaning whoever left them was heavy, maybe wearing boots. My own tracks from the day before were still visible, but these were new. I stood there, staring at them. It didn't make sense. No one should have been out here. I had heard nothing during the night. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick. It wasn't the kind of place you just wandered through by accident. I shook off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was probably an old hunter passing through. Maybe they saw the cabin, got curious, and left. That made sense. Still, I felt unsettled. I brought the firewood inside, lit the stove again, and made some coffee. The warmth helped, but the thought of those footprints stuck with me. I spent most of the day hiking around the area, exploring a little. The woods were dense, but I found an old overgrown trail that seemed to lead somewhere deeper. I followed it for a while before turning back, not wanting to go too far from the cabin. By the time I got back, the sun was already starting to set. I cooked a quick meal, ate, and then sat by the fire, listening to the wood crackle. Outside, the woods had gone silent again. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, it felt different, heavy, like something was out there, just beyond the tree line. That night, I woke up again, but this time I knew why. There was a sound outside. Slow, steady footsteps moving around the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. The footsteps weren't hurried, not like an animal moving through the underbrush. They were deliberate, careful. They stopped near the porch. Then silence. I reached for the flashlight next to my bed, gripping it tightly. I listened, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the silence was messing with my mind. But I knew that wasn't true. Someone had been outside. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I went outside immediately, scanning the ground. The footprints were there again, fresh. They circled the cabin this time. Whoever it was had walked around it, stopping at the windows, the door, watching. I decided to leave. Whatever peaceful trip I had planned was over. I packed quickly, throwing everything into my bag. I didn't bother with breakfast. As I loaded my things into the truck, I glanced back at the woods. Nothing moved, but I felt something there, watching. The drive back was tense. Every time I glanced in the mirror, I expected to see someone step out of the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching ahead. When I finally reached town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. The silence of that forest, those slow, deliberate footsteps in the night, I couldn't shake it. I never went back to that cabin. I never even tried to find out who had been there. Some things, I think, are better left unknown. I had been planning this solo camping trip for a while. Work had been stressful, and I needed some time alone in the woods to clear my head. I chose a remote location deep in the forest, far from any marked trails. I didn't want to deal with other campers. I wanted silence, just me and nature. The drive was long, taking me through winding mountain roads before I reached the rough dirt path leading to the forest. I parked my truck at the end of the trail, grabbed my gear, and started hiking in. The plan was simple. Hike about 10 miles in, set up camp by a small river I had seen on the map, and spend a few nights unwinding. I had packed enough supplies, food, water, a sturdy tent, and my hunting knife, just in case. The hike in was peaceful at first. The air smelled like pine, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I felt good, away from the noise of the city. But about 5 miles in, I started feeling uneasy. There was no obvious reason for it. No strange noises, no signs of anything off, but something about the silence felt wrong. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing and boots crunching against the dirt. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but that feeling of being watched never left. I reached the river just before sunset and quickly set up my tent. The river was exactly as I had imagined, calm, clear, and surrounded by thick trees. I filtered some water, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the moment. As darkness settled in, I felt that uneasiness return. It was too quiet. Normally, you'd hear owls or crickets by now, but there was nothing. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was being paranoid. I crawled into my tent and forced myself to sleep. A sound woke me up in the middle of the night. It was faint, like something moving through the trees. I lay still, listening. It wasn't the wind. There was a deliberate pattern to it, like footsteps. Slow, careful steps. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. About 30 feet from my campsite, there were footprints. Human footprints. Barefoot. They circled my tent. Someone had been here, watching me while I slept. I packed up immediately. My plan was to leave right away, but as I looked at the trail I had come from, something felt wrong. The footprints weren't just near my tent. They led back into the forest. And worse, they weren't alone. There were more prints now, like multiple people had been walking around. The realization sent a chill through me. I wasn't alone out here. I kept my knife in my hand as I started walking back. I moved quickly, but carefully, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. Every now and then, I heard something, branches snapping, faint rustling in the distance. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was following me. I forced myself to stay calm. Running would be a mistake. I could twist my ankle, get lost, or make too much noise. But I picked up my pace, my heart pounding. The sounds behind me grew louder, more frequent. Whoever they were, they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Then I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a tree ahead of me was a bundle of sticks tied together with what looked like old, rotting fabric. It wasn't random. It was placed there, meant to be seen. I didn't stop to examine it. I kept moving, my breathing sharp and fast. The sounds behind me turned into full-on footsteps. They were running now. I could hear multiple sets of feet crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I was being hunted. I broke into a sprint. My lungs burned. My legs screamed at me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The sounds behind me were getting closer. I knew I had only one chance: get to my truck. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the break in the trees. My truck was still there. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. As I yanked it open and jumped inside, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the trees. I didn't see a face, just a shape, a dark figure stepping back into the shadows. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and peeled out of there so fast I nearly skidded off the dirt road. My hands were trembling. My heart felt like it was about to explode. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road. I never went back to that forest. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Someone had been waiting in those woods, watching, following, and if I had stayed another night, I don't think I would have made it out. I always loved camping alone. There was something about the quiet of the woods, the isolation, and the simplicity of it all that made me feel at peace. I never worried about safety too much. Sure, I brought a knife and a first aid kit, but I never thought anything serious would happen. People go camping all the time. They hike, they set up their tents, they sit by the fire, and then they go home with nothing but sore legs and good memories. That was always my experience, until one particular trip changed everything. I had taken a few days off work and wanted to get away from everything. No emails, no calls, no people. Just me and the wilderness. I found a remote camping area deep in the woods, far from any marked trails. It wasn't an official campground. It was just a place I had found after hours of looking at maps, an area that seemed untouched, perfect for some solitude. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, and my usual essentials. I even brought a small fishing rod, hoping to catch something fresh for dinner. The hike to the spot was long and tough. The terrain was uneven, and at times I had to push through thick undergrowth. But the effort was worth it. When I finally arrived, I found a small clearing near a slow-moving river. The trees around the clearing were tall and dense, blocking most of the wind. The river provided a steady sound of flowing water, which was oddly calming. It was perfect. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the water that I could hear it, but not so close that the ground was damp. I gathered some wood for a fire and got everything in order before the sun set. As the evening came, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal. The air was crisp but not too cold. It was one of those nights where everything just felt right. I sat by the fire, eating and listening to the sounds of the forest. Occasionally, I would hear a branch snap in the distance or the rustling of leaves, but that was normal. Animals move around at night. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I had bear spray with me just in case, but I wasn't worried. I had camped enough times to know what to expect. After finishing my meal, I cleaned up and made sure all my food was secured away from my tent. Then, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep easily, the sounds of the river and the fire dying down lulling me into rest. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. It was pitch black. My fire had gone out completely, and the only sound was the faint trickle of water from the river. I didn't know why I woke up, but something felt off. I lay still, listening, waiting. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the random noises of animals moving through the underbrush. These were slow, deliberate steps. They were close. Too close. I held my breath, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated. If someone was out there, I didn't want to give away my position. I stayed still, listening, hoping that I was imagining it. Then the footsteps started again. They moved around the clearing, circling my tent. I gripped the knife I kept beside me, my fingers tightening around the handle. The footsteps stopped again, just outside my tent. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady breathing. Someone was standing right there. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Minutes passed, or maybe it was just seconds. Felt like forever. Then, just as quietly as they had come, the footsteps moved away. I listened as they faded into the woods until I could hear nothing but the river again. I stayed awake for hours, barely moving. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was out there? A hunter? Another camper? But why would they come so close to my tent in the middle of the night without saying anything? When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent slowly and stepped outside. My fire pit was undisturbed. My gear was untouched. But when I looked around the clearing, I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Large, heavy prints that circled my tent, stopping just inches from where I had been sleeping. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I had planned to stay for a few more nights, but I wasn't going to risk another night out there. I kept my knife in my hand the entire time, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made me jump. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. It wasn't until I was back in my car, doors locked, that I finally let out the breath I had been holding. I never found out who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just another camper who didn't want to announce themselves. Maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I never went camping alone again.